struggled a bit with what to present today in the short time. Since I was put on the panel that's addressing ethics of collective care, I originally wanted to excerpt a longer talk which specifically addresses this. That talk is grounded in an etymology of the word curate, meaning to cure or to care, taking into account how institutional collections of art and culture are closely tied to constructions of state power and custodianship linked to colonial theft, and how stewardship often enacts historical erasures. The care of the curator has a complicated historical trajectory to the present. There is little consensus as to how the curator should care, or who or what they should care for. I've been thinking through how to care by drawing upon ethical frameworks from other fields, juxtaposing examples from disability, justice, and care ethics with paternalist public health policies, particularly for how they view personal agency and pose frameworks for acting on the behalf of others. In short, conceptions of justice in the US tether personal dignity to independence or forms of care that enable the greatest possible autonomy. Liberal theorists have long excluded people with disabilities who will never be capable of the full autonomy they claim full social inclusion requires. So as a counterpoint, care ethics, melded with social disability theories, sees dependency in various forms as the basis of human dignity. So instead, I felt it was important to focus on practice over theory today. In a way, I'll try to address some of what Tufik raised yesterday about pirate care working upstream and downstream. I'll focus on ways that the artists and collectives I work with survive in and around institutions while building alternatives and imagining worlds elsewhere. Since contemporary art supposedly provides an experimental space in which the hierarchy of senses can be challenged and the relationships and power dynamics between various systems can be reconfigured, we've been exploring how to use art to creatively reimagine access and collective care. So care is a hot topic at the moment and a contentious one. In the US, after Trump's election, masses sprang to newfound political awareness. Many on the left invoked radical Black feminist Audre Lorde to relate to the ensuing burnout they felt. Quote, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." Simultaneously, private healthcare costs skyrocket, and a wellness industry that mistakes self-care for luxury pampering services misappropriates this very same quote. As the shelters that hold children at the US-Mexico border practice no hugging policies, debates have sparked as to what constitutes care when acting on another's behalf. Amidst this, arts practitioners revisit the work of feminists, indigenous, Black, disabled, and queer artists who have long investigated how trauma gets held and expressed through collective gestural, somatic, and haptic experiences. So as a freelance curator for the past several years, I've been working on a traveling exhibition entitled Sick Time, Sleepy Time, Crip Time, against capitalism's temporal bullying. So please note that Crip is a political reclaiming of the derogatory label cripple by disability activists. The project deals with the politics of health and care by showcasing the work of artists who examine the temporalities of illness and disability, the effect of life-work balances on well-being, and alternative structures of support via radical kinship and forms of care. I often make the silly joke that if you say the project's long and winding title 3 times fast, it's like a temporal reset. So the project has taken place at numerous arts organizations, including the Luminary in St. Louis, Missouri, Bemis Center for Contemporary Art in Omaha, Nebraska, the Elizabeth Foundation Project Space in New York, and Project Row Houses in Houston, Texas, as well as numerous social service organizations. A new version will take place in Detroit, Michigan this fall. So all of these iterations have taken place within the US context. Sick Time addresses the fact that the failures of biomedicine are felt by some disproportionately due to race, class, gender, and sexuality, as well as the effects of the over-valorization of independence in US American society. An ethics of care that recognizes dependencies emerging from disability justice has motivated works within the show. These artworks counter the over-valorization of independence and examine how racialized global capitalism, rooted in long process of colonialism, has produced debility in many populations, while at the same time creating bureaucratic structures that support very few people. The touring process-based exhibition is linked to an extensive programming series which involves collaborations between artists and various communities of care. So the first set of workshops, performances, and screenings took place between artists from New York, where I'm from, and groups of young single mothers and recently incarcerated women from Texas, thereby emphasizing what could be learned from the resilience of those carving out spaces of care in states where poor government support has long synced with the prevailing maverick ideology of independence, so the cowboy archetype here. Participating artists addressed issues directly related to their own lived experiences and facilitated encounters such as listening investigations, movement exercises, the sharing of community healing histories, and more. As all parties had knowledge to contribute, all were paid for their expertise. In the later version at Bemis, artists chose particular groups to learn with based on their own work and experiences. They also worked within the particularities of the Bemis Center as one of the only contemporary art centers in the area that is hugely important to a local art scene, but also hugely important to a local philanthropic scene. It is largely supported by money tied to agriculture and meatpacking. With Omaha having the highest resettlement rate in the US per capita for refugees in 2016 before the administration's policy changed, and being the convening point of numerous indigenous lands, some of the artists engaged how forms of care in Omaha are grounded in a sense of white benevolence that dates back to the early industrialists and settlers and continues into present-day arts and social service programs. So for example, in the closing programs, Fia Backstrom addressed the effects of barely visible forces on the medicalized body in her performance, The Growth in Its Perennials, which you'll be seeing some images from. Alongside this, Zave Martajano's performance, Territory, retraced pre-colonial landscapes and local immigrant histories through a parable of a fictional island that was carved up by colonizers, thereby considering the relationship between displacement, migration, and health. Zave's costuming was informed by a dialogue with Sacred Seed, an organization that preserves indigenous culture by growing traditional Indian corn. As part of their ongoing research, the two artists worked with refugee groups coping with the effects of assimilation. Zave facilitated workshops sharing healing movement modalities they use in their own choreographic practice. And as part of a mental health seminar that is held by the group normally, Fia added on to that and facilitated instead peer-to-peer storytelling by sharing her experience with Big Pharma after immigrating. And it is my belief that artwork created in this caring dialogical manner can help us move towards cultural equity. And it also relates to overthrowing the communicative confinement that Jana discussed yesterday. So I think in the bio, a side note is that I continued investigating the demand of certain narratives to unlock access to care in my subsequent show, which was influenced by Jacques Derrida's ideas on hospitality and hostility embedded in hospitality in relation to the figure of the refugee. So it's important to note the impetus to explore illness as a byproduct of societal structures while also using cultural production as a potential place to reimagine care was my own chronic illnesses and work in the realm of institutional critique. The hosting cultural institutions have become platforms to create community and share practices between sick artists and groups of people who are creatively and collaboratively surviving in this moment of heightened crisis, scarcity, and hate in the US. I'd like to now share a little bit briefly on how I use the site of the accessibility note as part of the show's architecture to challenge art organizations on their existing structures of support and operational norms. So just a quick show of hands, how many people know what an accessibility note is? I've heard of that. Okay. So the access note traditionally occurs on an organization's website alongside general visitor information, and it reflects on limits to the built environment that may impede access for persons with disabilities. So here you can see an example from the Whitney Museum, which has one of the oldest and largest access departments in the US. By understanding access and exclusion to be just as much social and economic as it is physical, in my curatorial work, I approach it not as a movement towards compliance via a checklist, but an ongoing and interrogative relational process. While access must be rooted in disability justice, it is also inextricable from senses of belonging determined by other identity markers. As disability scholar Tanya Chichkowski wrote in The Question of Access, quote, Access is a way people have of relating to the ways they are embodied as beings in the particular places they find themselves. By embodied, I mean all of the ways we have to sense, feel, and move through the world, as these are mediated by the interests of social environments, including race, class, gender, and sexual orientation. To approach access needs intersectionally when doing something in an art space, I require them to articulate a foreign language translation can be made available in addition to American Sign Language translation, or if bathrooms are gender neutral as well as wheelchair accessible and so on. I also think about whether the artworks I commission rely on just optical perception and how an exhibition or program can address multiple complex embodiments. I invite anybody to write to a publicly posted email address with needs and concerns. But I find that accessible spaces are best created when built into the artwork or through event facilitation that uses frameworks for collective care. I found that often needs are interconnected and overlapping, and the change that generates greater access for one person in turn benefits another. While a ramp might be necessary for wheelchair users, it might also be used by mothers with strollers or artists moving artworks. Or while ample seating designed for complex embodiments may be used for people with disabilities, children, or elders, they may also, if they eschew the too common minimalist designs, welcome those who are excluded in spaces coded as white through design and social etiquette. While incremental change can make valuable improvements and allow expanded levels of access for some, realizing spaces where power dynamics are truly reorganized is an impossibility, as we all know, without radically restructuring societies. If the museum and other large art institutions cannot be radically accessible due to their hierarchical organizational structures, one might wonder why I spend so much energy trying to transform them rather than solely build new structures for creative exploration in communities. Since institutions undergird US society, many people cannot survive with the support that comes from them, particularly people with disabilities. But I would also argue that independence from institutional models of care that provide poor support, as well as life beyond them whenever possible, remains essential. So one example would be the campaign known as Nick's campaign that Nick Dupree, an artist and disability activist, started when he was, I believe, 18 in the state of Alabama. So the idea is that after 18, basically there was no protection to give home care for people who are ventilator dependent. So he started a campaign that was arguing for institutional resources but not to be institutionalized, because that would mean at age 18 you have to enter into life in an institution. So that would be just kind of one example of where relying on institutions and parasiting from them or taking from them is necessary. Artist Park MacArthur has highlighted the importance of access shared by disabled people, constitutive of what we want and need, rather than mediating by an image that provides none. Groups and organizations that center and are organized by under-resourced communities and specific interest groups are necessarily already structured differently. So I consider them the best existing sites to form collectively organized mutable spaces where agency and dependencies can be reorganized. These are the sites where access is already best practice, experienced, and understood. So maybe in the Q&A I can get into a little bit of like how Project Row Houses is structured and why I worked there. But for time's sake, I just want to move on to a few of the projects. So I'd first like to share one of the show's projects by Canaries that practices this kind of access and care that I've been talking about, and that Park was talking about. So the Canaries are a network of art-adjacent women and non-binary, gender non-conforming people living and working with autoimmune conditions and other chronic illnesses. The group name references the phrase canaries in the coal mine, and is shorthand for those whose sensitivities are litmus tests of the environment's well-being. Canaries functions as a support group with monthly meetings, a listserv of a couple hundred members for sharing confidential advice based in one's own experience and support on surviving in and outside of medical institutions, and previously was an art collective. I am a member. Every time I say that, I feel like I'm like doing the hair club for men, and I am the president, a member. Not the president, there's no president. It's impossible to keep tempo with a society that refuses to integrate illness as an acceptable state. Sickness is often a taboo, producing social and economic marginalization that can be internalized as feelings of shame. In response to suffering from diseases that are often met with gendered or racialized assumptions of hysteria and hypochondria, the Canaries communities is based in the power of the first hand. A commons was initially formed through sharing personal experiences and simply being together. Much of what has been shared in meetings has to do with gaming the biomedical establishment while also seeking relief that is not accepted by it or may be illegal. The listserv functions the same way and has been used to share resources. So just one example would be when one member went off health insurance and needed meds that kept them going, that cost about $5,000 a month. Other insured members pooled theirs together and then used their insurance to get these meds for that member. So shortly after I had joined, I was amidst a flare of my own autoimmune disease, and I invited the group to contribute text and images addressing the question, how do you care for yourself during a flare-up? Oops. So the aim was to extend the group's comments to an ensuing newspaper publication, Notes for the Waiting Room, which I have a few copies if you want to look at. They're on the table later. The Canaries members left it in spaces that we feel some familiarity with and which we feel are relevant to investigations of our embodiment, the gallery and the waiting room. In an installation by co-founders Jesse Cohen and Carolyn Lazar, documentation of this act was to be sent to the gallery and displayed through the course of the show, thereby mapping a network of support. Designed to be reminiscent of a medical waiting room, their installation engaged and interrupts the choreography of such spaces. The intention was to challenge the unilateral and hierarchical transmission of information from doctor to patient and instead foster solidarity and embodied knowledge. So in subsequent versions of the show, the installation's architecture was folded into the curatorial structure, and you may have seen images from that in the rotating slideshow. And there was a reading room taking the form of a doctor's waiting room. So within it, there's a large selection of publications related to radical care and patient self-determination by artists, collectives, groups, and organizations, including my co-presenters, PMS. So there's a number of publications. They're often from local groups and collectives, as well as sometimes nonprofit organizations that are providing resources that are not commonly provided. And then also like the Young Lords Manual, the Black Panthers Manual, and various different texts and publications and zines. Okay, since I'm running a little long, I'll just quickly touch on one of the new commissions for the show's next iteration in Detroit. I was going to discuss another artist project by Cassie Thornton, which has its roots similar to my co-panelist project, as I understand it, PMS, in the Greek Solidarity Center's collective care model, but maybe we can get into that in the Q&A. It could be interesting to talk about. So Detroit, after declaring bankruptcy in 2010 and a predatory debt crisis, basic infrastructure like clean water and streetlights are lacking in Detroit. Channeling queer theorist Jasbir Puar's idea that the relentless pursuit of profit in racialized capitalism creates stability through the slow depletion of marginalized populations, this iteration will add works that address this process's effect on the city's population and the really inspiring projects that have come up amongst this. And it's worth noting that the city's population is over 80% Black and has the largest Middle Eastern population in Dearborn in the US. So one of these projects will be Black Power Naps by Niva Costa and Fanny Sosa. Their installation invites people of color to break with constant fatigue by slowing down, resting, and interacting with soft, comfortable surfaces in a series of Afrofuturist napping stations that use sound technology meant to combat the sonic warfare of urban spaces. While there are countless studies highlighting the capitalism-driven epidemic of mass sleep deprivation, what is often not highlighted is that Black people are regularly getting less sleep than white people. Black Power Naps is a direct response to this sleep gap, which the artists see as a continued form of state-sanctioned punishment born from an ongoing legacy of slavery. In this way, the giving back of stolen time through rest could be seen as a form of reparations. So whereas the work previously involved white visitors cautiously watching the activities not meant for them due to the demands of open access by funders or the norms of the hosting organizations, I approached Niv and Sosa with the express goal of making this a POC-only space. So we're in the process of developing this, and we hope to work with groups such as the Black Mothers Breastfeeding Group and the Prison Doula Initiative. And we also hope to leave it in a specific community center that lacks enough beautiful spaces, places to rest as a long-term infrastructure. Oops. Okay, I'll skip that. To close, my approach to curating has been to continue to work from inside institutions, to pressure them to move beyond serving large, undifferentiated publics, a unilateral, abstracted, paternalistic care, all while parasiting resources from them in order to support creative work happening outside and in spite of their confines. And maybe it's just worth noting that maybe that is particularly because of the duality I experience passing as well and white in institutional spaces. So maybe that influences the way I work. As the ossified structures that undergird Western societies are increasingly understood to only support an elite few, the improvisational choreography illness and disability often requires is something to learn from. If institutions recognize autonomy as a myth, they'd see that those that can't afford it, due to disability or other processes of exclusion, intimately know the beauty of what it is to need one another, to know, see, move, and feel. Thank you.
Thank you, Taraneh.